Welcome back. Well, big concerns for India on the foreign policy front. Ties with the Maldives have nosedived for some time now, and now they're refusing work visas for Indians. The Hindu reported some days ago that after India's opposition to the emergency earlier this year, the Maldives regime has turned completely hostile and some 2,000 work permits for Indians are not being cleared. Meanwhile, in another setback, the Seychelles has scrapped a joint project with India to build a naval base, something that was being touted as a big takeaway during Prime Minister Modi's visit there in 2015. My colleague Vishnu Shom has details on both these big stories tonight. Vishnu.
Well, India can't build a base on Assumption Island in the Seychelles. This is something that India had wanted for a very long time. And there are very important reasons for this. And that has to do with China's increasing presence in the Indian Ocean region, where frequently there are Chinese warships and submarines which operate. In fact, they are here throughout the year in an area India believes it is squarely in our area of operations, our area of strategic interest, which is why India was keen to build a $550 million airstrip, jetty and infrastructure on this particular island, Assumption Island in the Seychelles. But now the Seychelles President, Danny Ford, who is going to be in India on the 25th onwards, has indicated that, look, that's not going to be possible. Now, he says that there are domestic compulsions, domestic politics as a result of which this cannot go ahead. But why really is India concerned? Well, India is worried about this, a Chinese base in Djibouti. Earlier on, China had said that Djibouti is nothing but the base in Djibouti is nothing but a logistics hub, but in fact it has now turned out to be a full-fledged military base, a base from where Chinese naval warships can also refuel and rearm. Now, India is still very keen to keep up its association with the Seychelles and will be gifting a marine reconnaissance aircraft to the Seychelles leader when he arrives over here. In 2018 alone, 8 Indian naval ships have visited Seychelles. But is it a lose-lose situation as far as these bases in the Indian Ocean region are concerned for India? Well, not really. That's because India can access French bases in the Indian Ocean region. And remember, we've got a very close association with the United States as well, which has got a lot of resources in that region, and also some of the Gulf nations which allow India to have extensive access to facilities over there. But is the Seychelles the only concern? No, not really. The Maldives have been a real problem for India. The Maldives was seen to be an area where India needed to have an important strategic presence. But now the Maldives have said no to Indian workers. According to a report in the Hindu, the Maldives have rejected work permits for Indians. 29,000 Indians live on the islands. There are 2,000 pending work permits for Indians. Why has this all happened? Well, let's jog your memory. India had opposed very strongly the emergency in the Maldives in February.
All right, Vishnu, thanks for that. In fact, Vishnu giving us a rather exhaustive perspective on why both these countries are important to India and why all of this matters to us. Well, we have two distinguished former diplomats here in the studio with us, Ambassador K.C. Singh and Ambassador Vivek Karchu. Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation, is with us, and Manish Tiwari, spokesperson of the Congress, joining us tonight as well. Ambassador K.C. Singh, to you first. The Maldives, the Seychelles, the UK, didn't put Indian students on a special visa list. Things with the US are kind of shaky. You know how things are with China. Pakistan is a mess. Nepal is a mess. It kind of looks like the one area where this government actually was getting a lot of credit a few years ago is now somewhere where we seem to be faltering.
Well, firstly, you can't fault the government entirely for what happens. To pick up the name from the island, all assumptions are not always correct. So foreign policy is based on assumptions, on external environment remaining constant. It never remains constant. So what's happening in England or in Europe, that's driven by different factors. There's xenophobia, there's anti-globalization, what has driven Brexit there. So it's not India specific. We don't put it in the same box. Again, Maldives and Seychelles can't be put in the same box. Seychelles, as you know, a few days or a month and a half ago, there was a leaked report.
Yes.
Now we don't know from where it leaked, and then it became an issue in their parliament. So where there is a democracy, this plays into domestic politics. It's understandable that the president comes under pressure. He'll be here after a week. We can talk to him. We have to just assess that it should not mean that India is pushed out and the Chinese come in. So either they don't give a base to anyone, or it's a watered down base, because he's talking of really something they want to develop for themselves, we should work with them. I'm sure an arrangement can be worked out with Seychelles. Maldives is a different kettle of fish, and that is where I have maintained ever since this crisis has built up a year ago, India should have been proactive, we should have intervened. There's no other way to handle this, because since 2013, the President has consistently and continuously taken an anti-India stance, anti-democracy stance. He's literally banned all his opponents or banished them or put them in jail, including Qayyum, who was president, who was his half-brother and president for 20 years. So if this is happening in Maldives, certainly, and former president is inviting India to come and intervene and do something, I think in this immediate periphery, we required a greater Indian presence and pressure to make sure that we are able to reverse the trend.
Vivek Arju, the point is that these countries, in a sense, are thumbing their nose at India. I mean, these little islands are thumbing their nose at India and saying, we can scrap agreements with you, we will not give your workers permits, and you know, the list goes on.
Diplomacy requires a very thick skin. It also requires not emotional responses, but very cool responses, well considered. So I, for one, don't take these slights, and there are slights, of course, don't pay much importance to this. But for some time now, Nidhi, my mind is working that we now need to define on a national basis something that the political class and the security class has to think together of a security doctrine for our maritime neighborhood. The Indian Ocean and the waters around us will become increasingly important to India in time to come. Obviously, we can't have a Monroe doctrine, but while Casey is right that each case is specific, yet there is an overarching thing that we've got to define now. We've got to work to it. Some red lines have to be drawn. I'm reminded also of what happened, say, in Cuba with the Americans. In 1961, they launched a very stupid operation, the Bay of Pigs. But when their security was threatened in 1962, then we know what happened. There was a showdown. So while the Chinese are increasing their presence in the Indian Ocean, and this is relentlessly, it will go on as your report, Vishnu's report showed, we ourselves now have to think on a broader basis. Yes, in Seychelles, I think we'll be able to reverse it. Maldives, as long as no step is taken which will directly impact and adversely impact on our security, I think we should be able to handle it. But the time has come, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating it, time has come to define a kind of an Indian maritime doctrine.
Okay. Manish Tiwari, you had tweeted, in fact, about these multiple snubs that India seems to be getting on the foreign policy front. Do you agree with Vivek Arju that this can be handled diplomatically? I'm sure everything can be handled diplomatically, but the fact is that there's a certain sort of a hype and a hoopla that goes with these visits. They're very highly trumped up, and then this is what happens.
Well, I think, Nidhi, the problem is far more fundamental than what we are seeing in its manifestations in terms of the snub which has been administered repeatedly by Maldives or now by Seychelles. And the fundamental problem is that the Prime Minister and the NDA-BJP government went back on the first principles of Indian foreign policy, and those first principles were strategic autonomy and India's exceptionalism to engage with global powers, in terms of its own interests. And so therefore, from 1947 onwards, successive governments and successive administrations had finished the power dynamic between the global powers. But unfortunately, Prime Minister Narendra Modi tripped on it completely. And the Asian power dynamic is really determined by the interplay of five big powers: the United States of America, Russia, China, Japan, and India. And unfortunately, in the past 4 years, when you tripped on that balance, you found that the Chinese have become increasingly assertive in your neighborhood. So therefore, what is happening in Seychelles is not inspired or a leaked report which has really caused this crisis. It is the Chinese presence, and the Chinese are trying to muscle the Indians out of the larger Indian Ocean region. And therefore, the time has come to call a spade. And if you sort of vacillate between the sublime and the ridiculous, that one day you talk about the Quad, when you do not know whether the linchpin of the Quad is coming or going, that's the United States of America under Donald Trump. The second day you are in Wuhan, the third day you are in Sochi, and what you get in turn for Wuhan is actually homely delivered by the Chinese ambassador that there should be India, Pakistan, China trilateral, which is actually short form for China trying to mediate between India and Pakistan. It's a complete and absolute mess of your foreign policy. And I have not even mentioned Nepal and what we've been doing with Pakistan, the U-turn.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I want to talk to Manoj Joshi about that.
Compromised on those basic principles.
Yeah. Okay, Manisha, I understand what you're saying, and because Manoj Joshi, you wrote a piece on the government's foreign policy, 4 years, etc. And you said when you do the math, the outcome is disappointing, and you actually, elaborating from what Manish is saying, you've talked about this sort of confused foreign policy. One day you're trying to be friends, the next day you're trying to, for instance, blockade Nepal, then you want to be friends again. I mean, in your assessment, how much of a drawback are these snubs?
See, we are extremely lucky in one way. Where we are in South Asia and where we are in the Indian Ocean, geography favors us. But you cannot depend on geography alone. That's why you say geopolitics. And the second aspect of it, Vivek has mentioned this issue of the doctrine. I'm saying you don't need the doctrine, you need a strong navy. The problem is that under this government, defense budgets have steadily declined, including that of the Navy. Now the point is, you have Navy, you have capital ships of the Navy, excellent frigates, destroyers that we have built. They don't have long range helicopters, they don't have long range torpedoes. So what's the point of having any kind of a doctrine when you don't have the wherewithal to back it up? And what you're going to see steadily, in another decade, you will have at least 2 Chinese aircraft carrier battle groups in the Indian Ocean. What has happened to India's IAC-2, the second aircraft carrier we were supposed to build? God knows. No one knows. Frankly, have been asking around. No one seems to have any idea. The first one is kind of limping along, meaning the first one, our own IAC-1, which is being built in Cochin. But IAC-2, there's no trace. So my point is, it's one thing to develop this. Now, when it comes to these Maldives or whatever it is, at some point in time, so far we've been dealing on soft power. India has enormous soft power assets right across the Indian Ocean littoral, from almost from Egypt to the Middle East, East Africa, etc. But we also need to show that we are a serious military player in this whole business. And we cannot do this if we underfund our defense services, if we underfund in particular our Navy.
Vivek Arju? I don't think we can disagree with that.
No one will disagree that our defense expenditure needs to go up. We've got to pay far more attention to developing the Navy. But at the end of the day, the Navy is only an instrument. I was calling for a doctrine because I'm persuaded that we cannot allow a Pakistan to develop again in our neighborhood. And by that I refer to the fact that we permitted the Pakistanis to develop a nuclear option. And they developed it through the 1980s when, I will remind Manish, it was the Congress government in power. They took the ball off, they took their eyes off the ball while this nuclear option was being developed and a Chinese-Pakistani nexus was being established in a matter.
But right now the Chinese are all over our neighborhood like a rash.
But let us go to the basis. The Chinese-Pakistani nexus contributing to the Pakistani nuclear assets and their program was developing then. We took our eyes off the ball. We were helpless then.
Are we not doing the same thing today?
No,
we're letting China expand in the Indian Ocean?
Let me come to this. So therefore, as a nation, we must determine that we will not allow Pakistan to develop again in the Maldives or any of our neighborhood. And therefore, I am saying that this is not a party issue. This is a strategic issue. And that is why I've said the political class has to come together and the security class has to come together to think very carefully of a doctrine.
But
and
the point
basis
is,
has to be this
but the
I've
point is the
mentioned.
political class which is in power has to then have the vision to do that. I mean, these are reverses, for instance, with Pakistan, with Nepal, in parts of the neighbourhood. You're watching the Chinese sort of expand their footprint. Now, the Sri Lankans today have an issue with another agreement, which they've written about. Look at the Maldives editorial today in the Maldives Times, which basically says India shouldn't lecture us about human rights violations. Look at the UNHCR report on Kashmir.
Nidhi, this is, look, let's not forget, all through the Cold War, there were periods where India acted very firmly in the immediate periphery. So what Vivek is taking exception to a Monroe Doctrine, we did not call it that. We can call it whatever other doctrine. But we put Tribhuvan back on the Nepalese throne. We annexed Sikkim. We annexed Goa at a time that we were taking on Europe, and this was 1960. We split Pakistan into two. So in India's periphery, we have acted. And in Maldives itself in 1988,
that's right.
we para-dropped troops to ensure that Gayoom's government is not overthrown. So India has acted with a certain degree of force, but fitfully, not continuously. I think what's happened today is that Prime Minister Modi came into government professing a very muscular policy, and then he kind of made it as if foreign policy just began with him. And he broke up the national consensus to the extent that when he was abroad, he attacked the opposition, then opposition attacked him. So the consensus on the foreign policy and national security started fracturing, where he began to be attacked, where he made every success his. There was no history. It was fact-free, history-free discourse. Now that's coming to haunt him, because if that is what you said is there, then what is happening in Maldives? You are not even daring to intervene there. Seychelles is saying, I'm sorry, this is an issue for me. In Nepal, you first do a blockade, and now it's gone totally the communist way, and now you're looking for some kind of a bridge to them. And in the meanwhile, their prime minister is just going to be in China.
Exactly.
And we don't know what all they decide.
My point is that the Chinese footprint is only expanding.
So the fact remains that the Chinese are more powerful. China has already risen. You're in the process of rising. I think you need leadership that heals the wounds at home, gets the country together, and with the resources, marshals them better. And as Manoj said, your priorities have to be a blue water navy, Air Force, and so on and so forth.
I think that was an excellent point.
Because you have to have a blue. Where did 2611 come from? It came from across the ocean.
You get the last word then. You know.
Well, my last point is that in intervening in countries, we have to be very careful. We intervened in especially small countries. You know, this is not the era where you can bulldoze over countries. So I think there is a certain amount, you have to be a bit careful. In Nepal, we blockaded them and we are paying the price. I think even in the case of Maldives, I think we should give them a long rope. I said, as I maintain, geography favors us. We can play the long game in this. And I think if we play the long game, we'll be better off. You know, look at Sri Lanka. When Rajapaksa was doing various things, Hambantota, etc., today the Sri Lankans are paying the price of that. And they know that there's not a single ship that comes to Hambantota, not a single aircraft that lands in the international airport that they've built there. So my view is that we need to keep our nerve, but at the same time, we need to build our muscle.
Yeah, and I think that's been very well articulated by you. We're out of time tonight. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We're still watching this story closely. The leader of the Seychelles, the president, will be here next week, I think on the 26th. Let's see whether India is able to reverse what has happened with this particular pact. See you again tomorrow. Good night.